Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we're time travelling back to my favourite period in history, besides when dinosaurs roamed the earth, obviously. We're going back to the time of kings and queens, when expressing your true beliefs about people in charge got you hung, drawn and quartered. Now, amongst all the dark that went on during this time was the mysterious disappearance of the princes in the Tower. It was the summer of 1483 when two young princes arrived at one of England's most famous castles, the Tower of London. The purpose was for the oldest to be crowned the new King of England. But lo and behold, they completely vanished before this coronation could take place. More than 5 centuries later, historians like myself are still debating what actually happened to them. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty, we have to set the scene of what was happening in England at the time. So I guess it's no shocker that battles were going on, as is the norm during this period. The Wars of the Roses were a series of civil wars between the houses of Lancaster and York, with Lancaster being represented by the red rose and York with the white. Both houses were branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, and both claimed the throne through Edward III. The wars were essentially the result of the current Lancastrian King Henry VI's weak rule. No, not the one later on who had a king for mortality. Interestingly, it was Henry VIII's father who would end these wars by defeating Richard III. He will come up in a bit, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Henry we're focusing on suffered with mental illness, and as a result, political instability spread like wildfire. By 1461, it was decided by the Yorkists at court that Henry was no longer fit to serve as king, so they appointed the next in line on the Yorkist lineage, Edward IV. And remember, Henry was a Lancastrian. The Yorkists proclaimed Edward as King of England, citing Henry VI's incapacity and the Yorkist right of inheritance. This occurred while Henry VI was still alive, and it was supported by nobles and citizens who had lost confidence in Henry's rule. So although the first half of Edward's reign was unstable, in the second half it seemed, after years of conflict, that England had finally found stability. However, when Edward died suddenly and mysteriously in April 1483, at the age of 40, everything changed. So who actually were the princes? Everyone always knows the story, but not necessarily their names. So firstly, we have Edward V, who was 12 years old and the oldest son of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. Richard Shrewsbury was 9 years old and was their youngest son. So though Edward V was the direct heir to the throne after his father died, his youthful age meant he needed a Lord Protector to act on his behalf, safeguarding the realm until he came of age. And this ended up being his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Yes, the same Richard from earlier, but before he became king. Despite Elizabeth's concerns over the uncle's intentions, quite rightfully, the decision appeared completely normal. But within weeks, this transition of power to Richard would become one of the most controversial episodes in English history. So the Tower of London itself wasn't just a royal prison back in the day, it also served as a palace, and it was custom for a new monarch to stay there before their coronation. Edward's younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, was brought to the Tower to join him about a month later, and for the first time since their father's death, the two brothers were together again. To those outside the Tower walls, everything appeared to be proceeding as expected, but behind the scenes, the political landscape was changing rapidly. As Lord Protector, Richard was expected to rule only until his nephew was old enough to govern in his own right. But he did something extremely sly and declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid because of an alleged pre-contract for Edward to marry another woman. If true, Edward IV's children were considered illegitimate and had no legal claim to the throne. And if this is starting to sound a bit like Game of Thrones, you'd be right. The Wars of the Roses is literally what the show is based on. Whether this claim was genuine or politically motivated remains debatable. In June, Parliament accepted Richard's argument, and Richard's position changed dramatically. Instead of acting as protector, he became the rightful heir, according to this new interpretation of the law. And on the 6th of July 1483, Richard was crowned King Richard III at Westminster Abbey. This guy needs to be more subtle. Jeez. For some, his coronation solved England's immediate succession crisis, but for others, it raised an uncomfortable question. If the two princes were still alive, they could become powerful symbols for anyone wishing to challenge Richard's rule. Even if they had been declared illegitimate, many people would still have seen Edward V as the rightful king. As the summer went on, reports of the princes became increasingly rare. At first, they were occasionally seen playing in the Tower Gardens or looking out the windows, but the sightings became less frequent and eventually they stopped altogether. Most strangely, no official announcement was ever made. The two boys had simply vanished from public view, which is nuts because Edward was literally due to be coronated as new king of England. Like, imagine if that happened today. Just imagine. It was this combination of events that led many people, both then and now, to suspect Richard had ordered their deaths. Over the centuries, historians have proposed several theories, each attempting to explain what became of the young princes, and who stood to gain from their disappearance. There have been three main theories put forward. The first and most widely accepted is that Richard ordered their deaths. There's no argument that Richard had by far the strongest motive. By the summer of 1483, he had claimed the throne, but as long as Edward and his younger brother Richard were still alive, they remained a potential threat. Even though they had been declared illegitimate, many Yorkists still viewed Edward V as the rightful king. If either prince escaped or became the focus of rebellion, Richard's reign could be in serious danger. Supporters of this theory also point out that Richard controlled the Tower of London, so if anyone wanted access to the boys, it would have been difficult without his knowledge. The princes were never seen again after Richard's coronation, and I also think that the timing isn't coincidental. The princes were fine up until this point, but as soon as their father died and Edward became heir, they're suddenly gone, right from the location that Richard controlled nonetheless. However, there is one major problem. No contemporary evidence directly links Richard to their disappearance, so the case against him is built almost entirely on motive and circumstance. But come on! Historians continue to debate whether he was the architect of the prince's disappearance, or whether history, written under the Tudor dynasty that defeated him, unfairly cast him as the villain. But if Richard wasn't responsible, then who was? Another theory shifts suspicion to the man who defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field 2 years later. In 1485, Henry VII defeated Richard and became king, founding the Tudor dynasty. Like Richard, Henry also had a lot to lose if the princes were still alive. Their claim to the throne was arguably stronger than his, meaning they could have become rallying figures for anyone opposing Tudor rule. Some historians have suggested that the boys may have survived Richard's reign, but were actually killed after Henry became king. But again, the evidence is extremely limited. And by the time Henry became king, the princes had already vanished from public view for around 2 years, so when Richard was king, so they could have been killed during Richard's reign or during Henry's. Others believe the disappearance may not have been ordered by either king. One name often mentioned is Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. So Buckingham was one of Richard III's closest allies and may have believed that removing the princes would strengthen Richard's position, or even his own. And then some historians have also suggested that the boys may have died from illness or natural causes, with their deaths concealed to avoid political instability. Then, nearly 200 years later, an extraordinary discovery beneath the Tower of London seemed to offer a possible answer. But instead of solving the mystery, it raised even more questions. For almost 200 years, the fate of the princes remained a mystery. Then, in 1674, renovators at the Tower of London made a discovery. While demolishing a staircase in the White Tower, they uncovered a wooden chest buried beneath the steps. Inside were the skeletal remains of 2 children. Given where the bones had been found and the ages of the children, many believed they had finally found the missing princes. At the time, King Charles II accepted the possibility and ordered the remains to be reburied with honour in Westminster Abbey, where they remain today. For centuries, the skeletons have been regarded by many as the strongest physical evidence in the case. However, there are reasons for caution here. The remains were discovered almost 200 years after the princes disappeared, and the excavation wasn't carried out using modern archaeological methods. Little was recorded about the exact position of the bones, and other human remains had been found around the tower over the centuries. In 1933, the skeletons were examined by experts who concluded they were likely those of two children of a similar age to Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury. But because forensic science was still in its infancy, they couldn't determine their identities with certainty. Today though, DNA analysis could provide information, but the royal family refused to grant permission as they argue it could lead to more and more royals being exhumed from their graves. So what could be the key piece of evidence in the mystery remains beyond the reach of modern science. Without definitive proof of who the skeletons belong to, we are no closer to the truth than those excavators were in 1674, which is crazy. What makes this such an enduring mystery is that there is absolutely no certainty about any part of it. We don't even know if the princes were murdered. It's just a logical conclusion we have drawn. Historians are left trying to piece together a puzzle with only half the pieces. Another reason is that so much of what we know and what we're drawing conclusions from was written after the fact. Much of Richard III's reputation was shaped during the Tudor period, after the Battle of Bosworth. The Tudors, as Lancastrians, had every reason to portray the last Yorkist king as a tyrant, leading some modern historians to question whether Richard's image has been influenced as much by politics as by historical fact. That doesn't mean that Richard was innocent. It just means that we have to ask whether history has treated him fairly. In this way, the princes in the tower represent how history can be shaped by power, politics, and the people who survive to tell the story. And if you watch House of the Dragon, it's like those opening titles, the tapestry telling history from the author's point of view, not necessarily what happened, whether this is down to lack of information or to portray certain people in a positive or negative light. Until new evidence emerges, the truth may remain forever out of reach. So what really happened to the princes? Were they murdered on the orders of Richard III to secure his claim to the throne? Did they survive longer than history suggests, only to fall victim to another ruler? Or is the truth far more complicated, lost to time, buried beneath centuries of political rivalry and conflicting accounts? More than 500 years have passed, yet one of England's greatest royal mysteries remains unsolved. The disappearance of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury has inspired countless books, investigations and debates, but no theory has ever been proven beyond doubt. It is one of the reasons I love and hate history so much, because the mystery is so alluring, yet incredibly frustrating the more you try to figure it out. Sometimes all we have to work with are the echoes left behind from a period so far detached from our own. The Tower of London still stands today, welcoming millions of visitors every year, and only its walls know the truth of what happened so many years ago. And that is the case of the princes in the tower. Do let me know your thoughts on this one, and if you want me to do more historically themed videos like this, then I absolutely will. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.